Niche Knacks. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Niche Knacks, the one trans band podcast where I talk about my niche interest. If you're looking for something new to get into, this is the place to be. I'm Augustine, and this episode of Niche Knacks is about Hylics. Hylics is a weird, fantastical role-playing game developed and published by Mason Lindroth. There are 2 games in the series currently. Hylics 1 was developed in the RPG Maker engine and was released on Steam on October 2nd, 2015. Hylics 2 was made using Unity and was released on June 22nd, 2020. Hylics is a bit more of an experience than an actual game or a story, and this is especially true for the first game. It's incredibly surreal, and the games were made using a mix of stop motion, claymation, and pixel art. I'm going to talk about Hylics as one entity for most of it, but the finer details I'll differentiate between the 2 games because the 2 games are massively different. If you're the kind of person looking for a surreal video game experience, Hylics is absolutely the game for you. Now, enough being informative, here's why I love the game. First off, I want to say I found Hylics from a YouTuber and streamer known as Vinesauce. That's probably where most of the audience for this game also comes from. He's a pretty decent, well-known streamer at this point, I would say. I highly recommend his playthrough of Hylics 1. I haven't seen his playthrough of Hylics 2. I'm sure it's also good. But Hylics 1, it's about 3 hours long. It's very interesting. I really like Vinesauce's playthrough of it. What drew me into this game was, I think, the art style the most, which is probably will be common throughout Niche Knacks, as I am an artist. But it's very different and unique. Not a lot of video games use claymation. Pretty much the entirety of the game is like actual clay models that Lindroth made himself that he scanned with a 3D scanner. I don't even know what this technology he uses is. I have seen the scanner. I don't understand how it works, but yeah, he literally puts a clay model into a 3D scanner, scans it, and then boom, he has like a model of the clay, and it's so cool. Most of the clay he uses are not like, it's just normal brown typical clay, so he does color it like in post, I guess is how you would refer to it. That's where this pixel art really comes into play. As an artist, the binary pen is typically what the pixel art pen is called, at least in my art program, that's what it's called. So he like went over with a binary pen coloring his clay stuff. His also green screen of his own hands. They're pretty much most of the hands are him wearing like a leather glove or a latex glove doing the actions. It's not like a clay hand, it's a real hand. So there's also like actual stop motion or just straight up mixed. It's a mixed media game, and I love mixed media a lot. Because of like it's real clay and like real human hands, it's pretty uncanny. Some of the enemies, because it's an RPG game, some of the enemies are very like horrific looking. They're pretty reminiscent of like intestines and organs. It's just like straight up body horror. I love it though, as a horror fan. I think it's great. Going back to like, oh, this is a game that uses clay. I only know 2 other games that use clay as like a form in a medium. And there's a small escape room game called Clayscape. Also very cute, very short. I wish it was longer because I love the concept a lot. And the other one is I don't think it's an escape room. I think it's just a click and point adventure. It's called The Neverhood by DreamWorks. Vinesauce also did a playthrough on The Neverhood. I have not seen the whole video. Started watching it and just haven't had the time to finish it, but I really love the styles of Clayscape and The Neverhood, and I'd also recommend them. But Hylics is still like different. I think it really stands out from the other 2 because both Clayscape and The Neverhood are really like colorful in like a childlike way. I would say the clay doesn't seem like it was colored in post. It could have been, but that's not how it like looks. It looks like, oh, this clay is actually pink. Hylics is very obviously like it was colored with a pixel pen. And the color palettes are also very different. I'd say like Clayscape and The Neverhood use a lot of like saturated like greens and more like the child nostalgia primary colors. Hylics very specific color palette, especially in the second game. There's pretty much like 4 colors. There is a blue, an orange, a pink, a purple, okay, 5, and also pitch black. Those are your main 5 colors you'll see. There's also the bright yellow that we see in our main character, and some other colors, but those 5 that I mentioned, the blue, orange, pink, purple, and black, are very like, those are the Hylics colors, which is like really interesting. I love really cool color palettes being used in games like that a lot. Big fan. The overall feeling of the art style in the game, it really gives off a sense of otherworldliness. And if I were to describe it, it would be basically like you're on drugs. The game is very, like, especially the first game especially, and I'll go into more so why, but there's a lot of like, it feels like you're on LSD. Things don't really make sense. It's very unique, and I really like that. The clay, I just think the clay is so cool. And the character designs, kind of going with the art, are also incredibly interesting. Like I said, there's a lot of body horror, lots of organelles, and just intestinal looking creatures. One of the enemies is, in the first game, is called a flesh stash, which is like really funny. Its face is literally a fleshy mustache. That's the whole head of this creature. Very cool. I just love trippy and weird visuals. I really like the hippie 60s LSD aesthetic, which is kind of what I would consider Hylics, but Hylics is kind of like that LSD drugs 60s without being like the typical rainbows that you see. It's kind of like drugs in melancholy. It's a really beautiful game, but it's really guttural at the same time, and it's not a horror game at all. It's just it's just weird. I wouldn't describe it as horror at all, but it definitely has some elements of body horror in the character designs. The music is also really iconic, especially in the second game. Oh dear God, the second game's soundtrack is amazing. The soundtrack in the first game was composed by Lindroth by himself, and most of it's kind of like really heavily distorted guitars, and they kind of don't sound, the soundtrack for the first game isn't that great. It does fit really perfectly with the visuals, I will say, even though I don't really like the music in the first game. It's melancholic, guttural. It invokes like this auditory imagery of drifting through a world on a lot of drugs. That's how it feels. It's extraordinarily psychedelic in the best way possible. But Hylics 2. See, Lindroth, when he was making Hylics 2, he got a new man. He got Chuck Salamone. And the music is so good. Salamone's a great composer. And the second game's soundtrack is like music I genuinely would listen to. It's way more cohesive. It still has the same vibes, but it's just like better. My favorite track is Xeno Arcadia, which should be playing right about now. And God, I love this track so much. It's great. It does play in probably my least favorite part of the game. I played Hylics 2 myself, and there's like mini game segments that are platformers. They kind of blow, if I'm honest. I like the gameplay of it a lot, other than those segments. They're kind of tedious and confusing, but the soundtrack, it makes up for it because it's really that good. This track, Xeno Arcadia, was completely composed by Salamone as well. You can really see just like with how good this track is, I think that shows just how much his input on the music, like how much that really added to it. Going over the setting of Hylics, it's mostly made out of clay. It's very surreal, and I think one of my favorite, the standout location in Hylics is the afterlife. The afterlife is a really key component in the gameplay of Hylics, and I love it a lot. The depiction of like where you go when you die is really great. It's also like a pretty important mechanic in Hylics. You're expected to die basically, and when you die, you don't go back to a checkpoint. You go to the afterlife, and when you fight battles in Hylics, and by the way, it's an RPG Maker game. The gameplay is kind of something like Earthbound or even Undertale to some degree. Like it's a standard RPG Maker for the most part. But after you kill enemies, you will collect an item called meat. And when you die, in the afterlife, there is a meat grinder. And when you put meat in the meat grinder, it increases your max health. So it's kind of like, you're kind of expected to die because when you die, you get stronger. There's also NPCs in the afterlife in both games. The first game, I think all or most of the NPCs in the afterlife are like salmon. They're just fish flopping on the ground, which is weird. In Hylics 2, they're kind of like normal people, for the normal in quotation marks, normal for their world. The second game is probably one of my favorite games I've ever played. I love Hylics 2. I've never played Hylics 1, but good God, Hylics 2 is amazing. The first game, like I said, RPG Maker, it has a pretty standard perspective, pretty standard RPG Maker game. The second game was made in Unity, though. So instead of like the standard 2D, we're walking kind of in like a weird, kind of flat, shifted surface. In the second game, it's a still camera that follows your main character, and it's like 2D, but it runs on a 3D plane. And there's also an overworld in both the games. The first game, it's like, well, here's like a small little map that you traverse. There's not enemies or anything on it. And it's a flat thing. There are islands. The world in Hylics is like a bunch of islands. And in Hylics 1, you traverse these islands, you can walk, but there's also an airship that you can use to fly. And there's a cute little like sound that the airship makes when you use it. And it's pretty standard, there's nothing special. But in Hylics 2, God, so good, so good. Hylics 2, it actually completely shifts the perspective, and now you are like, the camera's behind the airship, and it's completely a 3D like flight simulator for when you're going to your locations. And the track during this is so good. I love the music during this part a lot. It's really, really great. And when I remember when I first got to the airship, because it's not something you have like available at the start of the game. When I first got to the airship, I was like astounded. Like, it was so beautiful to me. And I will say, just to give you like an idea, my love for Hylics 2, it comes from a place of loving Hylics 1 and waiting for years for this anticipated sequel. I think we've known about Hylics 2, we knew it was coming, its development, for a while. And when it came out, oh my God, it blew me away. It's really great. I highly recommend watching. You gotta at least watch a playthrough or play through the first game before going into the second one. You just need to see the improvement that Lindroth made over the course of the two games. I believe Hylics 1 took maybe like a year or so to develop, and Hylics 2 took way longer. As you saw, it took at least 5 years. So you gotta see like the improvement, because it is so great. It's really like inspirational, honestly. The characters in Hylics are also really neat. And the NPCs are pretty nonsensical. Both in the first and second game, you can't really tell like what they're supposed to be, because it's just like, it's clay, and there's not really like super harsh lines or in color differentiations in a lot of them to really tell what's going on. The enemy designs that you actually fight are more cohesive, especially in Hylics 2. There's some really great enemies in Hylics 2. The Hylics 1 enemies are kind of like, oh, these are weird little claymen, but in 2, they actually are animated. The enemies have animated sprites instead of being still sprite images, and they're so good. There is an enemy in Hylics 2 called a pool man, and basically he's just like a white guy made of clay, but his animation is he's pretty much doing the Fortnite like default dance. I love it. Like, it's great. So the main character you play as is a guy named Wayne. He has a crescent moon for a head, and he's probably wearing a latex jumpsuit. That's at least how many people interpret him. You could probably decide whatever you want, because his body's just pretty much black. I love Wayne. He's so cool. I like him so much. I put him in the logo for Niche Knacks, because he's iconic. But his name is Wayne. He's a moonhead because he is a waning moon. And throughout the game, both games, you gather 3 other party members. These are Daedasmon, Samsnosa, and Pongorma. The main antagonist of the game is a evil cult leader named Gibby. He's also a moon, maybe related to Wayne, I'm not sure, but he's a gibbous moon. That's why his name is Gibby. The main characters in the second game got really updated sprites and visuals, and they look so good. They look amazing. And you can also play as like a female Wayne. I don't remember, she had a name. I don't remember what it was though, but also, Wayne, his species of the crescent moon, he is a whole species. Not him, but there's a whole species of crescent moon people in Hylics, which is interesting. You also get to see Daedasmon. He has like 2 horns, which I think people thought were like kind of tentacles in the first game, but his face is basically 2 curled up horns. And you do see other people like in his species in the second game too. The only thing about like the characters is that there's not like a whole lot of personality. There's like some, and like their dialogue's pretty good, I would say, in the second game at least. But like I can't really give you super notable characteristics of the 4 main characters. Like I could tell you like what they do because they have like jobs kind of, but they don't really have personalities, which is like, I don't really care that much. I would say like the writing for characters is probably one of my favorite things in a story, and the most important thing to me are the characters, but Hylics is kind of the exception. I love the characters, but it's just like the experience of playing the game alone makes up for it, I think. However, the writing is very important to Hylics, and I definitely need to talk about that. So, Hylics 1 is written very differently from Hylics 2. Hylics 1 is almost entirely randomly generated dialogue. It is non-cohesive, nonsensical. It literally makes no sense because they're randomly generated sentences. Sometimes there are certain lines that are like, they do make sense because there is a story in Hylics 1. There is a plot. It's hard to follow, but there is one. Most of the time, even like the stuff that is supposed to make sense also is written in a way that doesn't. It's very interpretive, but most of the dialogue is genuinely randomly generated. And there is an actual lore purpose. Like there's a reason in the world that the dialogue and stuff is like this, which is so interesting. He didn't need to like add that, but I'm not gonna say what that is because when I got to the point in the second game that explains it, I was astounded. And speaking of which, the second game is written normally. The characters don't really talk as weird. It's like actually written. There's no randomly generated dialogue. But you do find out why everything was like randomly generated in the first game, which is really cool. I was like, whoa, I was really amazed by finding that out in the second game. But no spoilers, because you gotta go play the game yourself. Please do. I will say the plot of the first game is you're playing as Wayne, and you're basically going to go end Gibby's reign of terror. He's kind of like in charge. I think he lives on the moon. Honestly, I don't really remember because, like I said, the plot's crazy, crazy nonsensical. But yeah, the idea is you and your 3 other friends are gonna go end Gibby's terror. In the second game, this is not a spoiler, but in the second game, the plot is Gibby's cult is going to try to revive him, and you have to stop them, basically. So, I've been following Lindroth on social media for a while, like definitely years at this point. Now's a good time to get into Hylics. A third game is actually in development right now. I'm not sure when it'll be released or anything, but Lindroth does post quite a bit on his social media. He posts a lot of like enemy sprite animations that he's been doing. There have been actual like screenshots and stuff from the game. Looks like it's going to be a similar thing to Hylics 2, but I am excited, super excited for Hylics 3. I don't think you're playing as Wayne or a similar species to Wayne either, so that will be interesting. But every time I see him post something, I get really excited. Recently, he's been trying out a new style of claymation, which is really cool. It has a specific name, and I don't know what that name is, but basically it's an animation where you kind of roll up a piece of clay and then cut the layers, so you get to see. It's just really cool. You just have to go look at it. But yeah, it's like a layered cut of clay animating, and you could see like a bunch of colors. Really cool, and I hope he incorporates it into Hylics 3 too. So Hylics 1, probably more well known than the sequel because of Vinny's playthrough. Vinny is Vinesauce because of Vinesauce's playthrough. But still, Hylics 1 only has a little over 3,000 reviews on Steam. And this next part is ridiculous. Hylics 2, not even 2,000. Hylics 2 doesn't even have 2,000 reviews on Steam, and that is insane because Hylics 2 is so much better than Hylics 1, and it deserves all the recognition for who knows how many years, at least 5 years of development on Lindroth's part. Maybe less, maybe he started developing it a little bit later, I don't know, but it deserves so much recognition because it is a work of art. It's a truly great series and an absolute experience people should indulge in. Hylics is just weird core at its finest. If you're looking for a truly unforgettable, surreal experience, Hylics might just be your niche. Keep a lookout for your next niche snack. Next week, I'll cover a niche piece of horror anime called Gregory Horror Show.